How many pages is the U.S. tax code?
How many pages the stimulus bill is?
No, the tax code.
Tax code? A lot. I don't know off the top of my head. Welcome to the United States Government Printing Office.
Yes, I was trying to find out how large the tax code is.
I'm sorry?
The U.S. tax code. I was curious how many pages it is.
I'm not familiar with that, sir. I don't know what you're referencing.
It's the document that Congress comes up with to tell the Internal Revenue Service how to tax Americans.
Oh. And you're dealing with a recent code?
A what?
Recently for 2008 or 9 or what?
I mean, I guess like right now.
Hello, Internal Revenue.
Yes, I was trying to find out how many pages the tax code is.
Oh my God, I have no idea.
What about the head of the IRS? I mean, would he know?
Well, I'm sure he will, but you probably won't get through him.
So it's kind of like sensitive information that can't be...
No, it's not sensitive. It's just that none of us know. We have no way of telling you how many pages are in the tax code. We're looking at volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes. The only thing I can say is maybe your library would have that information because we don't have it on our computer.
April 15th has come again. It's time to mail your returns in to see what you have to pay or what's coming back. Well, it's all pencils and calculators, forms, receipts, and an hour later, Uncle Sam will get that old check. Will it be enough to pay for all the stuff we got today? Today we're not the same as we once were. Wars and roads and education, everything that makes a nation can't be paid for with a broken code. We gotta fix the system or go home. Gotta fix the system or go home. We'll cut taxes down or raise them high. Either way, the flag will fly. That's the mess that we're dealing with. The fair is flat, and flat is fair. Uncle Sam's down to his underwear while everyone preaches their new plan. Well, I don't care if you wrote a book or you think Congress is full of crooks. That don't change a thing for Uncle Sam. Gotta fix the system or go home. Gotta fix the system or go home. Fair tax, flat tax, VAT. Which plan is the best of these? I can't even read my W-2. X-tax, gas tax, gonna need some X-lax. Baby boomers all retire while our debt is climbing higher. Income or consumption base. Where my money? Misplaced somewhere in the code. Gotta fix the system or go home. Gotta fix the system or go home.
The problem with taxes in a democracy is that taxes are complicated and tedious and unpleasant. People don't want to talk about them, they don't want to read about them, they want to complain about them, but actually learning something about them is no fun for anybody. And yet they are so important to the way the government works, to the way the economy functions. We can't afford to not pay attention to what kind of taxes we have.
Ships of an alien source are approaching from the sky. Radio contact has been attempted but cannot be established. Instructions are to prepare for an attack by an unknown enemy.
The one obligation that every citizen has is to pay their taxes, and there's 175 million taxpayers who interact in the tax system. So that's the one thing that the federal government has that everybody has a stake in.
There's not an American breathing today that's not affected by the tax code. It affects his or her job. It affects whether or not you can afford to buy a car, whether your job's going to still be there next year. Everything a person in this country does is affected by the tax code.
I will succeed in creating a perfect being. When you think about how the tax laws affect every aspect of our lives, just about housing and healthcare and education and family and divorce, marriage, childcare, it goes on, retirement. There's such a connection between the way we tax, whom we don't, and the way government functions.
Hey, who do you think you are, anyway? Answer me, or I destroy you!
You're up against the fundamental limitation that the tax code has become a real monstrosity in terms of the complexity and the burden.
We have created a monster that seems not to be able to be controlled.
You add in all the crazy political action committees, and everybody has an agenda, and the lobbyists, and you have a mess.
In the last 20 years, I think we've amended the thing 14,000 times, added 3 million new words.
Even those who would like to make it efficient and make it work, it's still a monster. Nobody understands it.
Every time you add a new provision, and there's been 14,000 new ones in the last 20 years, you have to put something in a form to cover that.
The average American spends, I think, 57 hours working on their taxes. Many of them hire accountants because it's become so horribly complicated.
Perhaps the first question you should ask yourself is, do I really enjoy doing figures? If you have a distaste for mathematics, it is not the work for you.
It is so complicated, you have no idea whether or not you've done it right or not.
Taxes, budgets, paperwork, pollution. There's just no getting around it.
Whether it's an individual or a small business operator, he can call the IRS 3 different times and get 3 different answers about the same question. It's so complicated the IRS doesn't understand it.
We want the taxpayers to know that we're here to help. After all, they are the ones that we really work for.
The IRS, contrary to what most people think, really has nothing to say about what the tax code is. It's just given the tax code that's passed by the Congress and the administration and said administer it.
None of us ever hesitates to criticize Congress at every opportunity. But how many ever stop to think about the broad powers of Congress and how these powers affect every one of us?
The way the Congress of the United States works, things have to be in a just total smack against the wall crisis for anything to get fixed.
The tax system is so complicated that a lot of people feel like they're not getting their fair share of all the tax breaks.
Almost everybody feels that the other guy is escaping taxes.
And as they believe increasingly that it's not fair, that reflects on all of government.
One result is the April 15th phenomenon. This alien force, from Mars or something, is taking away your hard-earned money. Not, I'm participating in a community where we made common decisions, and I'm glad to be able to participate in it, which is the way a healthy society would work.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that our democracy, as we've known it, is at stake.
We live like parts of a machine. We don't know our fathers or mothers were raised in cubicles. The sick and the old are put to death.
It is the one and only way to maintain the supreme race. Have you forgotten?
Our people have forgotten. They have been made to forget.
If we believe that we ought to have federal assistance for not just hurricanes and floods, but highways and our court system and police on the street and our education system and our health system and the Food and Drug Administration, if we want a Securities and Exchange Commission, if we want a Federal Trade Commission, if we want to have the things that we've grown used to, which may be excessive now. Some of them may be and others we want to look at. But if we want government, federal government, to look after the public in lots of ways because society is so complicated, we will not be able to afford that.
The current tax system just isn't up to that challenge. We're going to need an efficient way of raising revenue, and one that is fair and that people perceive to be fair.
We face problems in this country right now, fiscal problems over the long term that are so serious that we should all fear for the safety of our children down the road. Americans cannot ignore that. They're going to have to just cowboy up and deal with this nasty, boring, tedious topic because it's just too important to ignore. objections to taxation are framed in terms of why this is unfair to me, why this is unfair to people like me, why it treats other people differently than it treats me. And I think that that outrage that can develop around special treatment and favoritism is a key to understanding American tax history. The U.S. was born of a tax revolt, but it was actually not a revolt against high taxes. The Boston Tea Party was a revolt against tax loopholes. The British had passed a law that granted certain special favors to a few merchants who were selling tea, and American merchants resented the monopoly that had been granted here and the tax exemptions that had been granted, and their objections to the British tax were really directed at the loopholes that were part of that tax, not at the tax itself. It's important because it is Americans' first experience with really throwing the tea into the harbor, but simply to say, we are not going to stand for this kind of special treatment. We are not going to stand for taxes that don't treat everyone equally. That's the kind of tax revolt it was, and there are more tax revolts like that over the course of American history. Many of the arguments over taxation in the early republic, in the early years after the Constitution was ratified, were about taxation. Thomas Jefferson's party generally believed that the federal government should confine itself to import duties and fund itself through a tariff. The Federalists insisted on using internal taxes as well, and that produced quite a bit of conflict, including the Whiskey Rebellion. An internal tax more poorly tolerated in this period of time. It outraged farmers who were depending on the production of whiskey to make their living and who felt that it was unfair to impose a tax on their products specifically. It posed a significant threat to the federal government, but in many respects gave the federal government an opportunity to demonstrate for the first time that it was able to take care of itself. The federal government sent troops into western Pennsylvania and quelled the rebellion and established that the federal government not only had the legal authority to impose these taxes, but also had the power to impose them as well.
During the Civil War, Lincoln knew that the government needed revenue, and so they actually adopted the first federal income tax.
One of the striking things about this wartime tax was that it was conducted in public, and anyone could go and ask to see them. They could go to the local collector's office and say, I want to see my neighbor's tax return. This was about as unpopular as you would expect it to be. People really felt like this was an invasion on their privacy. They didn't want people pawing around in their personal affairs, but there were many people at the time, including many political leaders, who felt that this was a vital component of the income tax because it ensured better compliance. If your neighbors could go in and look at your tax returns and see that you weren't reporting a reasonable amount of money, they could report you to the tax collectors, and they might go and investigate, which they had the right to do. The South was much more reluctant to impose heavy taxes and relied much more than the North on loans, on printing paper money, also on just confiscating goods that they needed for fighting the war. And the results were financially disastrous for the Confederacy. They never were able to develop a robust tax system, and I think in part this was a cultural resistance to tax policy, especially in the early years of the war.
Well, no one loved the income tax in the Civil War. It was a necessity, like all taxes are. But it was tremendously helpful in enabling the Union to pay for the war without entirely resorting to borrowing. And you could argue that the income tax really helped the Union win the war.
Surrender, my poor army.
But as soon as the war was over, everyone wanted to repeal it. It was a distasteful tax, and they repealed it step by step. But as they did so, starting in the 1860s and then the 1870s, there were warnings, even from Republicans, who said, this tax will come back. We'll have to turn back to it again, either because of a crisis, a military crisis, a war, or because of an economic crisis. And this is the tax that Americans are going to have to get used to in the future. What happened at the turn of the century was the emergence of a middle class and an upper middle class of professionals. The man who symbolized them was Teddy Roosevelt, and who embraced the income tax, although he didn't get it passed, but he embraced it during his presidency.
There's a continual and fairly spirited debate about how to reintroduce the income tax in a way that would pass constitutional muster and that would allow lawmakers to reduce their dependence on tariff duties and replace them with something more progressive.
By 1913, we had the 16th Amendment, which was necessary because of a Supreme Court decision that said that you couldn't have the income tax constitutionally without the amendment.
Right around the same time that Woodrow Wilson became president, the income tax was part of the reforms that he then enacted into law through statute.
So you create this income tax in 1913, it barely gets its feet on the ground before World War I once again disrupts tariff revenues, creates a revenue crisis for the federal government, and Congress turns to the income tax as the most likely replacement for this in the time of war.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
During World War I, the top tax rate moves from 7% to 77%. And suddenly, taxes become a huge concern of a lot of people. People came to Congress. The first deduction, the first one that was really focused on the tax laws, was the charitable deduction. And that's because presidents of universities and colleges came to Congress and said, look, we're not getting contributions. You're taking 77% of the top dollars of rich people. So Congress said, well, we'll give you a charitable deduction. And very much that's the way the laws evolved. So in the early 1920s, suddenly there was a special rate for capital gains, a low rate for capital gains. There was relief for contributions to retirement plans. And little by little, the income tax became something other than a revenue-raising system. It became also, as it is today, a way of trying to micromanage the way people behave, or to give them relief for certain behavior, hoping that they will behave in that way.
The war is over, and there'll never be another.
The war ends, and there's a sort of scaling back. There's we don't need as much money anymore. We do need to retire some debt, but we can let go some of that wartime taxation, some of that painful, sacrificial wartime taxation.
The leader of that effort after World War I was Andrew Mellon, who was such a powerful Treasury Secretary that he served in 3 administrations. People often said that 3 different presidents served under him.
But I think what's most striking about Andrew Mellon is not that he cut taxes, which I think almost anyone would have done in the wake of World War I, but that he, by cutting taxes, by sort of defanging the income tax and making it more moderate, ensured that it would survive. If Woodrow Wilson made the world safe for democracy, Andrew Mellon made the world safe for income taxation. He made it a tax that people could tolerate.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Before World War II, 1939-1940, no more than 10% of households paid the income tax. It remained a class tax. But then Pearl Harbor happened, and Hitler invaded Europe. And Franklin Roosevelt came to the Congress and came to the American people and said that the future of the United States was at stake. And he said, so we have to move from a tax on the few to a mass tax, that is, on the many.
But the rich pay the taxes. Why should I worry?
That's where we're fooling ourselves.
This was a really important change. They lower the exemptions, and suddenly millions of people who have never paid an income tax in the past and who have And some of them aspired to the notion of someday getting to pay income tax because it would mean that they were rich. Well, they were not all that rich and suddenly finding themselves paying income taxes.
The 1942 revenue bill will impose the heaviest tax burden ever placed upon the American citizens.
For single people, now the value of dollars were different, of a dollar was different, but single people paid a tax on income over $500 under the 1942-1943 Revenue Acts. The National Association of Manufacturers, interested in today not paying more taxes than they absolutely have to, they said that no business should make more than they absolutely needed to stay alive. And taxes should consume everything else.
Corporation rates have also been substantially increased on both normal and excess profits. We believe these rates are adequate to prevent anyone realizing undue profits out of the war effort.
This is a big change. It makes the income tax much more productive, helps it raise much, much more money. It also poses all sorts of difficulties for the federal government because they have to instruct all of these people in how to pay their income taxes, which is not an easy thing to do. They instituted a huge public relations campaign to tell people that this was their responsibility, they were going to have to do it. They wanted to make the connection between the sacrifice that people were making on the battlefield and the financial sacrifice that was being asked of people on the home front.
I am willing to pay taxes to provide national defense for my country, to see that we have an army, a navy, and airplanes strong enough to protect us against any invader.
It wasn't just about changing a financial instrument, it was really about changing political culture and civic rituals in an important way, and really creating a whole new civic ritual. I mean, Americans had never been united by this annual responsibility before, and suddenly, it was actually in March then, but what's later got moved to April. April 15th has become sort of a national anti-holiday. It's a day that we all recognize as part of our civic responsibilities, as our role as Americans.
For as long as Americans have been debating the income tax, they've been debating two definitions of morality. On the one side is what I call virtue, which is this idea that Americans have that wealth that they gain is the result of virtuous behavior, saving, investing, hard work, taking risks, and that you don't want a tax system that punishes that, and therefore you don't want to punish people as they make more money. But on the other hand, Americans believe in essential fairness, and that, especially in a time of war and sacrifice, you have to have a system that's fair and supported by everyone, and that system does the opposite. That system would make people who have more money pay taxes at a higher rate. I think most of us would sympathize with either of those views, and maybe we go back and forth. I think that's probably true of most Americans. But at any given time, one of the ideas is uppermost.
These issues, many of which now involve an economic concern, were of virtually no concern until the Kennedy administration.
Kennedy.
first president of the modern era to embrace the issue of the income tax was John F. Kennedy.
Such a bill will be presented to the Congress for action next year. It will include an across-the-board, top-to-bottom cut in both corporate and personal income taxes. It will include long-needed tax reform that logic and equity demand. And it will date that cut in taxes to take effect as of the start of next year, January 1963.
Kennedy came along and his tax advisors came along and said, but these high rates retard economic growth. And that began the real conversation about the relationship between tax rates and economic outcomes.
He hadn't given out little increases in the personal exemption or the standard deduction. He'd actually gone in and slashed the World War II and Korean War tax rates, the marginal rates, across the board. He took the top rate down from 91% to 70, and the bottom rate down from 20 to 14. And we had several good years of growth after the Kennedy tax cuts. Unlike the later cuts of the 1970s, which were just these little handouts on the first $2 or $3 or $5 that you earned.
I think it was really in the 1970s that taxes became a big national and almost moral issue.
People started getting a lot more unhappy with the government. You have the Vietnam War and Nixon and Watergate and all those things. And also in the 1970s, you get incredible tax increases that weren't actually enacted by the Congress. It was because of inflation. It turned out that when there was high inflation, people were being pushed into higher tax brackets. It might be that you used to pay tax at 30%. Now you really have the same spending power as before, but now you're paying some tax at 40%.
So we decided at the end of the 70s that we needed to try that again. We needed to repeat the Kennedy experiment to see if lowering the marginal rates and perhaps putting on the investment tax credit that he had also used to spur investment might get us out of the stagflation.
And of course, the man who rode that issue into the White House was Ronald Reagan, who I like to think of as the poet laureate of capitalism.
I'm a citizen. I'm not an office holder or a party official. I'll make a speech at a bus stop if enough people are waiting. I was a Democrat most of my life. I have a long penance to do. If you're unwilling to meet this challenge, then you'd better start preparing, deciding what you'll tell your children it was that you found more important than freedom. They'll want to know.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people.
No one before or since has painted such a visionary picture of how Americans are burdened by the tax system.
In short, a punitive tax system must be replaced by one that restores incentive for the worker and for industry. A system that rewards initiative and effort and encourages thrift. Now, all these things are possible. None of them will be easy, but the choice is clear. We can go on letting the country slip over the brink of financial ruin with the disaster which this means for the individual, or we can find the will to work together to restore confidence in ourselves and to regain the confidence of the world.
Ronald Reagan came into office believing that high tax rates discourage economic growth and discourage people from working harder. The context for him was the movie industry.
All right, get on stage, you prima donnas. Let's go. Get on for stage door key to team.
Hey, fellas, get a load of this wire. Anybody I know, John? We're going on tour. What do you know, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington? Washington? Hey, wouldn't it be something if the president came to see us, the chief himself?
He'd make a certain number of movies, and then anytime he made another movie, he figured that 80 or 90% of the income he was getting from that movie could go to the federal government. So he would stop making movies and go off and ride horses. He just became convinced, based on his personal experience, that a high tax rate discourages people from working hard and going the extra mile to be productive. And he rode that idea because he believed it. And because he was such a great communicator, he rode it into the White House, and he rode it into the brains of Americans.
We must go forward with a tax relief package
I shall ask for a 10% reduction across the board in personal income tax rates for each of the next 3 years.
He was the sponsor, the supporter of the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. And it's the first time they gave a name to a tax reform.
The important thing now is to hold to a firm, steady course. Tonight, I want to talk with you about the next steps that we must take on that course. Additional reductions in federal spending that will help lower our interest rates, our inflation, and bring us closer to full economic recovery.
David Stockman admitted when he was the head of Congressional Budget Office for Reagan was that in fighting for low tax rates, he expected the Reagan Revolution also to reduce government. But the Republicans found that there was too much entrenched in the government programs. And so government spending went way up. So it really didn't test supply-side economics in the best of conditions.
Reagan sometimes gets credit for massively lower taxing, but that short period between 80 and 84, when I was here, he lowered the tax rates, and that was very good, but he also had 3 tax increases. Social Security taxes went up and other revenues went up, and it was all canceled out, and spending went up and the deficit exploded.
One of the things about Reagan was that when he was convinced that we needed higher taxes, he just went out and gave a speech.
We're within sight of the safe port of economic recovery. Do we make port or go aground on the shoals of selfishness, partisanship, and just plain bullheadedness? The measure the Congress is about to vote on, while not perfect in the eyes of any one of us, will bring us closer to the goal of a balanced budget, restored industrial power, and employment for all who want to work. Together, we can reach that goal.
On a bipartisan basis in the Senate and the House, people really began to study what taxes do to the economy, how people change their behavior in response to different tax policies.
In the early 80s, tax shelters were really rampant. There were stories all the time about rich developers who built empty office buildings that made no sense from an economic perspective, but saved them an enormous amount of money in taxes. And people saw that as just a travesty. They thought it was unfair. Rich people were getting away with murder, and they understood that the tax system was unraveling.
You could actually sell tax credits. Businesses could sell investment tax credits that they didn't need. There was a market in the Wall Street Journal. You could buy the right not to pay taxes.
We had a situation where half of our big corporations weren't paying any taxes, and many of the other ones, the other half, were paying quite a bit.
Reagan came to believe that this really wasn't right. And he was a man of certain very strong convictions. So he said to his Secretary of the Treasury in 1984, come up with a proposal that vastly simplifies the laws, that's fair to everybody, that doesn't really raise more revenue, but does it in a sensible, economically sound, and fair way, and that makes the tax laws more transparent.
Reagan didn't put a lot of preconditions on it. He said, I want to lower marginal tax rates, and I'm going to keep the tax break for mortgage interest. He thought that was sacrosanct. Basically, everything else was on the table.
Once tax reform is out there, anyone who kills it, the saying was he has a dead cat on his doorstep. Anyone who killed tax reform was immediately under suspicion of having done it as some sort of sleazy payoff to the interest groups, which it's true enough hated it. So Reagan has this risk of a dead cat on his doorstep. I think he genuinely believed and wanted to do it, but he is sort of forced politically to come up with a plan that's more feasible than the pure Treasury One plan. Then it goes to the House of Representatives, where Congressman Rossotti, the Democratic chair of the Ways and Means Committee, he has to do something too.
The House plan, actually, they restored a lot of the special tax breaks and the rates went back up. Reagan originally had proposed a top rate of 35%. The rate was even higher in the House plan, and they'd restored a lot of the special tax breaks.
It was a tax reform proposal that died, frankly, legislatively numerous times, and Ronald Reagan had to reach into the Congress and say, no, we have to finish our job here, and would resurrect tax reform.
Then it goes to the Senate, to Senator Packwood of the Senate Finance Committee. Initially, I think it's fair to say he really hated it. He came around a bit, but part of the thing was that he would be the one who killed it. He didn't want to be the one who killed it, so he had to do something else.
Packwood and his staff came up with the idea of what they called the 27% solution. They taxed capital gains the same as other income. Before that, capital gains had always been taxed at a lower rate, And by eliminating a whole host of deductions and tax breaks, and by putting a big tax increase on corporations, they were able to lower the top rate to 27%, which was very, very appealing, and Reagan liked it a lot.
So we managed to get a tax reform that was a terrific deal for low and middle income people. Overall, raise taxes on corporations and the wealthy, but cut taxes on enough wealthy people and enough corporations to keep those lobbying forces at bay.
They eliminated about a third of all the special relief provisions. They brought tax rates down for everybody. Only people said, not going to last, because providing tax relief is so much a part of the political campaigns. What can I offer people that will make them think I'm for them?
And they'll push and I'll say no, and they'll push again and I'll say, read my lips.
No more trickle down. We don't need across-the-board tax cuts for the wealthy for nothing. We need to say, here's your tax incentive if you create American jobs the old-fashioned way.
I will use this moment of opportunity to bring common sense and fairness to the tax code.
You will not see your taxes increase one single dime under my plan. Not your payroll taxes, not your income taxes, not your capital gains taxes, nothing.
By the elements alone, they will grow to millions of times their original size in less time than it takes for the sun to rise and fall.
The tax system has become a bit of a playpen for politicians of both parties. Whether they're Republicans or Democrats, it seems like for every real or imagined problem in the country, some politician has an answer that involves more complication of the tax code.
What you are looking at now used to be a great city. That was long ago. Phew. It's the home of monsters now.
Our tax system, in the way it's used by government, it's basically a vote-buying system. It is used to curry favor with voters.
Politicians in both parties have come to see the income tax as a kind of Christmas tree, full of goodies they can give away for one constituency or another. And there's been this bipartisan consensus that the way to pander to the electorate is by creating new tax credits targeted at particular groups.
It's that monster again.
And we can control his actions, don't worry.
Why the tax code? Why not just send the money out in a check? Well, things get hidden in the tax code. And you get credit for two things when you put a subsidy, a special tax break into the tax code. A, you get credit for the subsidy. And B, you've cut taxes. So you didn't increase government spending, you cut taxes, and wow, that's a twofer.
I don't understand. Why do you have such monsters anyway? You're so advanced and all.
Congress people have to look like they're doing something. There's the whole impetus in Washington is to, you know, as Bill Clinton used to put it, feel your pain, you know? Let's give them a little tax credit for it, and it's not going to make a dent in the real problem, but it's going to look like we're doing something.
Well, now, where do you think this country would be without politicians? Do you think that the average citizen would take time off to help run the country?
There are many who would.
All the average citizen thinks about is making money. He's got no time for politics.
The public is being taught that to pay taxes is painful. That's why you need, quote, relief. It's an affliction. And if you can mitigate that in some way, if politicians can offer you just some more relief from that, you'll be better off.
We found to our regret that it made uncontrollable monsters as well.
The tax system has now gotten to the point where Congress uses the tax system the way my mother used chicken soup. It's a cure-all for any ill affecting society or the economy.
You can pick almost any program area you want. There's a tax program that looks basically like a government program run by an agency, but it's run by the IRS instead.
You know, the little credits for this and that are offensive because they don't work. You know, they cost money and they don't work. That's not a good combination.
The general principle, I think, you derive from most tax relief is that the most relief goes to people who need it the least relief goes to people who need it the most.
Survey shows American people today better housed than any people in history.
When I first read that on the release, I thought to myself, they call that news? Everyone knows that.
Now, I write and have talked a lot about how the home mortgage interest deduction is something sacred. I mean, it's a third reality. No candidate is going to say that we ought to eliminate it or greatly curtail it. I think that the question that you'd ask for the home mortgage interest deduction is the question you'd ask for all relief. Why is it there?
The proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. And that particular kind of pudding tastes right nice to us.
In 2006, the bottom 52% of all taxpayers, over 50%, they got just 2% of that $66 billion. The top 3% got about 30% of it. Well, can you imagine in this Senate Finance Committee hearing saying we are now announcing just that outcome? We're going to give 30% to the top 3 of you, and the other 52%, why don't you just get out of the meeting? Go home, because we don't care to help you become homeowners. And that would be outrageous. It couldn't happen, but it does happen in the tax laws. And so many of those things occur because it's not transparent. And politicians don't want to talk about it because they talk about how marvelous it is to help you own a home.
Homes that are the finest that can be had for the means and the mode of life of those who love, hope, sleep, work, eat, yes, live in them for America.
The child care credit. I mean, child care is expensive for everybody. It's incredibly expensive. If you have one child, let alone 2 children in child care. And so Congress enacted a child care credit. Well, who gets it? Well, you only get a credit, which is a dollar for dollar credit against your taxes. It offsets $1 of taxes if you owe taxes. But listen to this, and it just seems so strikingly unfair. If you earn hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and you have 2 kids in child care and you're the executive of some top company, you get the $1,200 tax credit. If you earn $25,000 and you don't owe income taxes, you don't get any help. Yet you're the ones who need the help the most.
That's the kind of business we like.
These are outcomes that if they don't make social sense, if they don't make economic sense, and they drive up tax rates, we ought to say to our politicians, and I'm asking them, why?
All right, hold off the questions.
Why the mystery, Bill?
I mean, right now we have tax credits for babysitters, tax credits for college, tax credits for kids, and this is the kind of junk that makes the tax code tens of thousands of pages long. It's the kind of junk that creates the field day for the politicians and the tax lawyers to play their games.
It's just not clear that you should really be using the tax system to encourage home ownership or anything else like that.
The tax system should raise revenue and then try to do as little else as possible, because almost everything else that it does is harmful.
But what people don't realize is while the federal government spends $3 trillion a year, roughly, in direct spending programs, it also spends indirectly $1 trillion a year in tax preferences. By that I mean the federal government forgoes receiving revenues of about $1 trillion a year because of deductions, credits, exemptions, and exclusions in the tax code.
What happens to the average person is, if you look at the hundreds, if not thousands, of special preferences in the tax code, I bet every single person watching this benefits from 1 or 2 of those special preferences, and they think, we better keep the system in place because I benefit from loophole A and loophole G. But what they don't realize is that their neighbors are benefiting from loophole E and loophole L, and then the neighbor on the other side is benefiting from loophole W and loophole C. And so everyone is, in some way, has their snout in the trough of special interest tax provisions, but what does that mean at the end of the day? The rate is higher on all of us than the income that is taxed.
You see that almost half of all income that individuals could be taxed on will not be taxed. And probably people watching this will say, well, John, that's fabulous. But there are consequences. The first consequence is that there's really a close relationship between tax rates and what can be taxed. So if only half of all income can be taxed, people have to pay much higher tax rates than they would otherwise.
Wouldn't you rather give up 50 cents of loopholes for $1 of lower tax rates? That's in effect what tax reform is all about.
Simplifying the tax laws, making sense of the tax laws, there isn't a politician who won't tell you that they're for it. And then they'll go out and say, and what I'm offering now is a credit here, an additional deduction here. Nobody wants to eliminate the relief that's already there. Almost no one. So the politicians all are for decency, honesty in the tax system, simplification, transparency. You'll hear that, and you'll say, oh, that's somebody I'm in favor of. But when it comes down to actually depriving anybody of these provisions, it's very hard to get them to do it.
Report preliminary findings.
In his second term, President Bush said that one of his objectives was to simplify the tax code for very good reasons. The burden is great on the taxpayer.
I am firm in my desire to get something done. We're going to take their work and we'll go to the Congress and say, let's work together to achieve something very constructive for the American people.
Unfortunately, other priorities took the place of that, and the president was instead, at that point, preoccupied with the Social Security reform, which didn't go over so well.
Well, that's the story on that particular project.
These politicians don't willingly give up power. They're not going to give up the power they have under our current tax code.
If only there were more power, Betty!
Is there any way to generate more power? We've got to have more!
Politics has screwed up all efforts to do tax simplification. I personally define politics as a curious form of juvenile delinquency. Well, what happens when you try to push a good idea through the legislative process, every politician says in so many words, what's in it for me or people that are significant to me, like my campaign contributors.
See what they teaching you up at that Yankee University? Bad manners?
The special interest groups and the politicians have a very cozy relationship where they get to exchange campaign cash for special interest loopholes. And that's a game that the American people lose, but it's the special interest groups and the politicians that win.
The rhetoric is always there to help the people stick it to one group versus the other, class warfare, that sort of thing. That's all they talk about, but it's all politics.
Don't rile me, boy. Don't rile me.
We have 35,000 lobbyists in Washington whose sole job is mostly to get a tax break for their employers.
What people will do will be to lobby for very, very narrow benefits. A particular exemption for a particular product, or a particular exemption for something that is manufactured in a certain way, or a particular exemption for research.
A business can come in and make a big donation to a member of Congress, and he'll hear them out about particular things they want versus some other business or a labor union or a nonprofit, even church groups and others.
Yeah, Mac, the 5 G's is in the bag.
If you have enough lobbyists in Washington so that there are 70 lobbyists for every member of Congress, I think most American citizens understand as they sit at the dinner table at night, man, I'm grossly outmanned up there.
I had observed the process of members seeking committee assignments for a lot of years and participated in the process. I don't recall ever having had a member come to me and say, Dick, I want to be on Ways and Means because I'm interested in the tax code. It was, I want to be on Ways and Means because it's an excellent committee from which to raise the funds for my campaign. Same with Senate Finance. Well, how do you raise funds? You, in fact, peddle tax favors.
Yeah, 25 and about a quarter and a half and about a half and about a half, and thank you. Now 75 and 75 and 25, thank you. Not quarter.
We'll get this campaign help for you. We'll do that for you. We'll do this for you. You've got to help my client out with this little tax problem they're having. We have tax exemptions for specific manufacturers of ceiling fans.
I can't get it out of my mind, Gaines. We're crooks. You talk as if you're just finding that out.
As long as we're electing people and they've got friends who help them get elected, and they've got friends who are giving them money or giving them jobs after they leave. There are always going to be reasons why lawmakers want to do favors for certain people. Sometimes they're good reasons. Sometimes they want to help an industry. Sometimes they want to help a company that's in their district. I mean, these are good reasons. But all of that leads them to clutter up the tax code.
We have a bulletin just received. According to a report not yet confirmed, a beast of seemingly gigantic proportions has been sighted lurking in the hills due northeast of town.
We're going to come to order. I'm committed to do all we possibly can, this committee, this year, to set the stage for significant tax reform. I believe that virtually no one in the Congress has a sufficient grasp of the code.
There's a dozen proposals that have been introduced in the Congress, I'm not going to name the sponsors, to revamp or reform the tax code, including proposals for a fair tax, flat tax.
There seems to be a consensus gathering that we need, quote, tax reform. There is not a consensus, however, about what that means.
How, as we move forward with the discussion on tax reform, should we factor in the need for us as a government to be fiscally responsible?
How do we move to any of these systems when many of them would do away with the popular exemptions and deductions, such as the deductions for mortgage interest payments?
Just all things being equal, is there tend to be a more efficient way to raise revenue compared with other ways?
As you said, Mr. Chairman, our tax system is badly broken. No one quarrels with that. You mentioned the train wreck coming in 2010.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to close this hearing down. We're way late for a vote. Hearing's adjourned.
A long-standing issue in tax policy is whether you should tax income, how much people produce, or consumption, how much they spend. And there's been a philosophical debate that's gone back to Hobbes and Locke and philosophers hundreds of years ago.
Yes, it's amazing when you stop and think about it.
Americans have been schizophrenic in the way that we go about taxes. Sometimes we want to just tax the consumption, that is the sale of things, and other times we want to tax just income, and other times we want to tax savings or the return to investment through capital gains and dividends. And what it's come down to now is that we just basically tax everything.
Ever since there's been a tax, the phrase tax reform has been very popular. How can you be against it? To an extent, everyone will define tax reform as what I want, that's tax reform.
Now, none of us like crystal gazing, so let's take a look at what is actually happening now.
We do have a tax system today which is a hybrid. We call it an income tax, and that's kind of funny because it's not. It's about 1/3 income tax, 1/3 consumption tax, 1/3 neither.
Consumption, spending, is basically just the difference between the amount you earn and the amount you save and the amount you pay in taxes. But under a current income tax, there are a lot of ways in which you can basically get a deduction for savings as move in the direction of a consumption tax. So if you put money into your house, you get to deduct the mortgage interest. If you put money into an IRA or into a 401k, or your employer puts money into a pension, that's not included in your income. So again, that's the same kind of tax treatment as you get under consumption tax.
You must understand.
Every economist will tell you that many will favor a consumption tax, but if you have an income tax which doesn't try to do all of the manipulating of the way in which we behave, stays out of it, and lets the markets, pretty much control those things, that we'd have a stronger economy. That means higher wages, more savings, more investment, stronger companies, more companies that can compete internationally. That's a huge advantage.
Everyone in the policy world would prefer a broad-based, low-rate income tax to one like what we have now. But nonetheless, tax reform has kind of been converted into, it's now predominantly identified with having a consumption tax.
Now, there are many ways in which you can go about creating a consumption-based tax.
One example of a consumption-based tax is to have a national sales tax. But a flat tax, at least properly defined, is also a consumption-based tax.
There's more to it than that, Joe. There's something behind this, something we don't understand.
Certain types of income, capital income in particular, don't get taxed under a consumption tax. And that will leave certain people with much lower tax bills, much lower tax bills. Rich people will pay considerably less unless the system is designed carefully.
Huh, what an imagination. Right, that's just what it takes most of all. Creative imagination.
The advantage of taxing spending rather than income is that it's thought to be more efficient. It encourages you to save. The current tax system basically discourages saving, and there's not any particular reason we want people to save less than they would otherwise. And if you look at the horribly anemic savings rate in the United States, it certainly would be a good idea to raise it. Right now it's around 0.
And when we return, power to the people, opportunity to the American people, responsibility to the American people, this nation is going to move ahead in a way that will astound ourselves and the world. Rest up, because, my friends, our journey has just begun.
So I ran for president in both 1996 and 2000 on the flat tax. Fortunately, the message did better than the messenger. Under the proposal that I had, for example, you'd have a single rate, 17%, that would apply after generous exemptions for adults and for children, and there'd be no tax on your savings. Everything would be tax-free on your savings. And there'd be no death tax. I think you should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. You've paid enough during your lifetime. Or as our founders would say, no taxation without respiration.
You earn your income, you report your income, you deduct your family allowance, you apply the rate, and you're done.
The virtue of the flat tax is that it unleashes people's minds, thinking, creativity, onto productive pursuits. Instead of spending 6 billion hours a year, filling out forms, you could waste the time. That would be more productive than you could let the brain regenerate.
It just doesn't take much time to explain that flat tax is just there. That's it, man. That's about it. Anybody can do it.
And I endorse the fair tax because it's the best hope we have of finally changing the tax system in this country.
There was this group of businessmen in Houston, Texas. They just had this little, call it a game if you want, I don't know, but they would tackle problems.
2 other fellows and myself were having lunch, and in our usual way, we were complaining about the state of affairs in the country.
And they said, okay, we're going to now hire completely impartial experts, and we're going to ask them to come up with a new way of collecting revenue for the federal government.
We ended up taking 2 years and $23 million to complete this study, out of which came the fair tax.
We stop taxing income and start taxing consumption.
You get rid of all corporate income tax, gone. No personal income taxes, it's gone. Payroll taxes, gone. Estate tax, death tax, gone. Capital gains taxes, gone. And all of this is replaced by one embedded federal retail sales tax.
When you buy something new at the retail level, you pay the tax. You know exactly what you're paying.
If you buy used goods and services, used house or used car, you pay no sales tax.
Every household will get a cash distribution at the beginning of every month that will totally untax them up to poverty level spending.
It essentially untaxes every poor and elderly person from their basic necessities such as food and medicine and basic utilities.
And I know taxes are boring, but what's boring about getting 100% of your paycheck? What's boring about not having to keep tax records? What's boring about not having to keep receipts? What's boring about not ever worrying about an IRS audit? Those things aren't boring, and that can be the reality if people get on the bandwagon with the fair tax.
Now, in the political world, the consumption tax is basically a conservative move. It's basically a way of saying we're going to tax rich people less. They save more than poor people, so more of their income comes from saving. We're going to make it less progressive by not taxing them as much. In the academic world, it's very different. You have people who are liberal Democrats who favor it as much as conservative Republicans. And the argument is for a progressive consumption tax of one kind or another that would be approximately as progressive as the system we have now.
Regarding a value-added tax, ineffective value-added tax is just a different form of national sales tax. It's what they call a national sales tax in Europe. And the reason that the European countries have put in a value-added tax instead of a national sales tax is because the value-added tax, in some sense, is self-enforcing.
And one question is, why do European countries rely so heavily on value-added taxes? They rely much more on consumption taxes than we do in the United States. And the reason is, I think, that they don't rely on the whole tax system. They don't rely on the tax system as their primary means of providing progressivity.
I think in the advanced countries, the developed countries of the world, there is much more emphasis on the role of the national government.
They finance a lot of their higher education through the government. They have universal health insurance that they finance. And so you can't just look at the tax, you also have to look at what the tax pays for.
Those countries tend to have much higher taxes than we do. So they combine the income tax with the consumption tax, and you see in France and Italy and Sweden and Norway and Denmark and all of those countries, much higher levels of taxes. In fact, our current total federal tax burden is among the lowest of all developed countries in the world, and yet we feel we're overtaxed. Well, maybe we feel overtaxed because we don't like the services, but relative to our income, we're very low. So in Europe, much higher taxes and higher social services. So that's the trade-off. Are we willing to experience that?
You know, I never realized just how much these things meant until now.
One of the things that you really know when it comes to taxation is that no matter how bad the system might be, and I think it's really indefensible, it's the system that in some way people know. They don't really know it, but it's what they're familiar with. And so even though they're unhappy paying accountants and others, even though they know they have to keep far too many records, it's tough for them to say, well, let's go to a simplified system that they don't really know and they don't necessarily trust. Are you going to cut out all of my deductions or most of them, tax me on a lot of fringe benefits and other things, and then once you have them gone, are you going to up my tax rates above what you said? Can I trust you? So how do you build a reform movement that is built on trust rather than just promises? And I think that's one of the great challenges.
If you're an activist out there and you want to make America better, you want our tax system to be simple and fair, what's the best way to go?
What would he like for dinner? He just loves chocolate cake. Go ahead, try one. All you have to do is follow the recipe. This is going to be easy. Let's see, what's next?
The goal of fundamental tax reform should be simplicity, number one. You know, we have an amazingly complex tax system that by some estimates costs Americans over $280 billion a year to comply with.
You must stir the ingredients in your chocolate cake. To stir is to mix food materials with a circular motion to secure a uniform consistency.
We really have to think about reforming the tax code either incrementally or as one big change. There's really about 50 reasons, and they are China and India and Japan, Malaysia, you name the countries, South Korea, and the entire European Union. Everybody in the world is working to become more competitive. It is a competitive global economy. Everyone's trying to compete because if you can compete better, you prosper more.
But you really have to ask, if the only part of the country that's really booming is the capital, is there something wrong with the government? And I think there is. It's too self-centered, it's too worried about its own well-being, and it is not doing what is necessary to make the country grow.
Cream butter means to manipulate with an instrument until it becomes soft and smooth.
When you find yourself sitting down and running numbers to figure out where it makes more sense for you to live and what kind of house you should have, you realize the extent to which tax actually controls your day-to-day choices.
We like to use the tax code to do little token things, and we've been doing more of those in the past 20 years, and that's why we have these 4-page tax returns.
This social engineering business, they give you a housing interest tax credit so you'll buy a home, and then they give you a marriage penalty so you'll live in it out of wedlock. You know, what are they trying to do? Just leave people alone.
That's right, pour it in. The recipe says cream the butter, so put in lots of cream.
We use the tax code for a lot of things other than just collecting tax, and actually a lot of times we're not very serious about collecting tax.
There's over $300 billion a year, $300 billion a year of taxes that are not paid that should be paid, under the law. So look at it that way. That means everybody that's honestly paying is paying 20% more than they need to make up for the $300 billion that's not being paid. So when you add that together, that's an enormous inefficiency.
Just look at that silky smooth texture of that batter.
Sneak taxes. We sometimes get a tax increase and we don't even know it because the code is so complicated. I've been hit with a sneaker tax many times and didn't realize it until after the fact.
I think people want the simplest tax system we can possibly give them, and one that's transparent, that they can understand why they have to pay the amount of tax they have to pay.
No, Margie, your cake didn't turn out so well because you misunderstood a term in your cookbook.
One of the things that people talk about in terms of a tax code is whether it's fair, and that's, of course, a very general term that is very subject to interpretation as to what everybody thinks is fair.
We have to recognize that there are inequalities in the country. There are tensions because of economic inequalities. We need to debate why those inequalities have come about, and we need to debate how much we want to do to level out those inequalities, because only if we have that debate can we proceed intelligently.
Later, you may be required to beat egg whites stiff but not dry, or so that they hold the greatest amount of air without losing their elasticity.
You need to make sure that you're generating enough revenue, at least over a business cycle, where you can pay your current bills, and where ultimately, over time, you're projected to generate enough revenue that you can keep the promises that you intend to keep. And that's what Washington has failed on.
Yes, even Margie found that she could learn to cook when she discovered the significance of the terms used in cooking. And Tim will never know she ruined her first cake.
What coalescence of things, what can happen that makes tax reform possible? You need a strong president. My guess is that it would have to be in a second term. Secondly, you need leaders within the party who say in the back rooms, look, this is serious. We need to get together and provide the congressional leadership. And third, it needs to be some grassroots movement. Most great movements actually come from the grassroots. So you need all of those elements. And I'm still optimistic enough about this country and its people to believe that we're capable of that.
I don't know that many people who like to pay taxes. But taxes are a necessary thing when you are trying to finance a government and to meet the broader interests of society that otherwise can't be met by the private sector or aren't being met by other levels of government, like the state and local level of government in the case of the federal government. So they're a necessary evil.
There is another way of looking at taxes. The other way of looking at taxes is that when April 15th comes along, you're happy because you can contribute as a member of the community to achieving community goals that are established by a democratic participatory process. In that sense, taxes are a good thing.
Because, you know, the way you tax, a lot of people argue, really defines what you are as a country.
We're going to have to find a way to pay not only for all the debts we're accumulating right now, but also to pay for all of the promises we've made to senior citizens. And you need a working tax system. You need a tax system that's perceived as fair and can raise enough revenue. It's going to need to raise a lot more revenue than the current system. The Congressional Budget Office projects that if current trends continue, health costs continue to grow faster than the economy and baby boomers age and retire, that spending on 3 programs for the elderly, Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, will take up 18% of GDP. That is the historical average of all spending for the government.
You've got to come to terms with the fact that over the long run, we can't afford the benefits without increasing the taxes. Now, you can't imagine anybody saying that. Obviously, the candidates are saying, we're going to have you pay less taxes.
We can't afford to lower anybody's taxes, and the only way you can get people's attention, regular average people's attention about tax reform, is if you tell them you are going to lower their taxes. If you just say, well, we're going to rearrange and you're going to pay about the same amount, they're not going to want to listen to that.
And sometimes you have to make choices that don't sound politically convenient because the alternative is just too dreadful to imagine.
Until there is a conception of participating in a democratic society, and a conception which is real, not just words, but it means you really are participating in a democratic society. Until that's the case, discussion of taxes is fiddling with technicalities and missing the point.
What's happened is that we feel less connected. And so the appeal not to pay taxes, it's your money, you can do better with it, means that why are you helping somebody else who doesn't have some immediate connection to your family or neighborhood or community? It used to be people went to school with the people they worked with. And managers, owners, their kids, workers, blue collar, white collar, there was an enormous mix and interaction. And I think there was a much greater sense of that we're all in this together. In order for these things to happen again, somehow we must capture that sense that we are one nation, we are a community. And then we have to decide, well, what is it that the federal government should do as opposed to the state or local government, as opposed to ourselves individually? Those are tough decisions, but what can the federal government do best? And what shouldn't it do? And we need those conversations to be going on throughout the country.
There's a reason why I've spent my life on this issue. It's that it is simply too important to ignore. And inertia is so strong that it requires all of us to pay attention so that the tax system doesn't just get worse, doesn't just get more complicated, doesn't just get more inefficient. Other people will pay attention, the wrong people will pay attention, and they'll get the tax system to do what they want it to do. So if Americans as a whole want to prevent people from making out like bandits and want a tax system that treats them fairly and that is good for the country as a whole, they have to engage this topic. You can't avoid it, and you can't just complain about it.
What the politicians fear in their heart of hearts, the Washington politicians, I think, is not a loss of revenue. They know over time Washington will get its take, will get its cut, it'll do just fine. What they really fear is the loss of power.
We have a right, when government becomes abusive of liberty, to abolish or change government. This is changing government.
Every American citizen say, if I don't like this tax code, I need to seriously determine what in my mind is a workable option and get behind that.
If taxpayers demanded it, the politicians and the political leaders would respond, and we could get a dramatically better tax system for everybody.
Washington has overpromised and underperformed, and it's time that stopped, and it needs to stop now.
I think every American ought to start understanding there is a way to fix this. We don't have to live with this onerous burden. We don't have to continue to say, oh, we're losing ground with the Chinese, losing ground with the Mexicans. Nonsense. Let's start gaining ground. Let's start empowering Americans again.
The current system is a disaster for our children and grandchildren. Democrats and Republicans alike care about their children.
The rest of the world is changing. The rest of the world is becoming more competitive. We have to keep working every year to become more competitive, and a big place to do that is in the tax code.
I, for one, am not convinced that unhappiness with the tax system is going to be strong enough to get it to change on its own right. I just don't think that lawmakers will muster the will to make a fundamental change in the tax system until their hand is forced. We're just waiting for that moment.
income tax, eh?
Yes, that's right. The harder you work, the more you pay.
Aye, it can seem like that, but you earn more too, remember?
Yes, I earn it, but who gets it?
Man, your ignorance is phenomenal.